100 years after the Russian Revolution, there is little trace of the former world hegemony that it once spawned. Today we live in a US-led unipolar capitalist world, where the current status of the class struggle is reflected by the de facto neo-colonial and neoliberal regime of the G7, the WTO, NATO, and the 800 US Army bases around the world. This combined global power faces no serious organized resistance other than from ISIS in the Middle East, which fights Western ideology but not a neo-colonial, neoliberal world order. At present, it seems that humanity and all historical forces have been reduced and assimilated into an all-powerful global neo-colonial and neoliberal order. The level of assimilation that humanity has reached within the global neo-colonial order lends support to the conclusion that there will be no more revolutions like the Russian Revolution of 1917. But this conclusion does not mean that capitalism is victorious. If anything, the demise of the bureaucratic model of socialism can only mean that capitalism has been left to its own devices. This in turn makes us realize that it has been a Pyrrhic victory, particularly when we recall its greed-based competitive nature and environmentally destructive capacity. There are plenty of signs also that support the view that the system is either on a path of qualitative transformation, as it has previously demonstrated on various historical occasions, or of self-destruction. At the apogee of world domination, capitalism has effectively and efficiently concentrated both global and local wealth in just a few hands. 8 people are said to possess half of all wealth in the world and drag the planet to the brink of global environmental disaster. Within this context, I wanted to connect some of the lessons gathered from my own experience in the Civil War in El Salvador. For the reason that my views on revolution come from someone who has been a participant in world conflict from the standpoint of a colonized, working class, third world person, and not a white middle class person from an industrialized country. Both perspectives, although not divergent in some essential features, have the differing historical points of view of peoples who have lived as victims of colonial and neo-colonial oppression, and of those who have not. I also hope to present several motivational arguments with the idea of putting up a call to arms, so progressive, critical thinking, and radical people could perhaps widen their global perspective on where we are and what needs to be done. Revolutions are political events that arise due to the specific historical reasons related to economic oppression and political suppression of other people. Once a revolution has broken out, it does not follow anyone's expectations, nor can it be forced beyond its natural geopolitical boundaries. This principle also leads us to think that revolutions do not have moral characteristics. If anything, the only characteristic that revolutions have is their capacity to disrupt the status quo at the expense of society in general. José Martí, the Cuban patriot, is credited for reflecting on the essence of revolution, having said that one revolution is still necessary, the one that will not end with the rule of its leader. It will be the revolution against revolutions, the uprising of all peaceable individuals who will become soldiers for once, so that neither they nor anyone else will ever have to be a soldier again. Following this lesson, it is safe to say that there is no such a thing as a socialist, anarchist, or nationalist character to a revolution. This can be demonstrated by the fact that countries with nationalist and socialist revolutions are now part of the globalized world order. This lack of character also leads us to think that the great lesson learned from the 20th century revolutions is that revolutions are the local expression of the global evolution of human society. Revolutionary idealists may be able to keep the revolution on a certain path until it falls back into the mainstream of the social evolution of that particular society, which is also influenced by the global direction in which human society is moving at the time. I believe we need to take this lesson into consideration when thinking about future revolutions. The idea of revolution is the logical but painful conclusion when all peaceful avenues to solve a conflict have been exhausted. The idea of revolution does not spring like a magical conclusion from a classroom studying nationalism, Marxism, or anarchism, nor out of an educated and principled conviction held by people who have raised their political or class consciousness. A revolution is initially born spontaneously from the most oppressed sectors of society, and everyone else is pulled into the conflict through its destructive dynamics. It is a huge and complex event that distorts the normal development of a society. In order to understand such a term, one must experience the suffering, the hurting, the unimaginable acts of violence, the constant danger, the death of it in various terrible ways, the mourning of beloved relatives and friends, the psychosocial, emotional, and physical impact on the lives of children and the older, the loss of privacy and of freedom, and the terrible social dislocation that countries that experience it go through. Revolution is not organized, and much less by activists who dedicate their spare time to it or see it as a hobby or extension of their professional occupation. There is no such a thing as a revolution created by revolutionaries. Revolutionaries are only figures of opportunity. So we have, with the implosion of the USSR and the socialist bloc, that we lost a counter-hegemony to capitalism. And all the countries of the former bloc became members, or have mostly become members of NATO. And we have seen the rise of a unipolar global capitalist hegemony. We have lost also the political alternative to capitalism. And with it, the implosion also has come with the decline of Marxism and the discrediting of communism and socialism in general. In the same process, many communist parties were liquidated, and the existing communist parties are no longer relevant in national political life. Some communist parties even turned into neoliberal social democratic parties. And at the end, the new communist movement that was trying to be formed again has become pretty much irrelevant in international politics. Communism has been judged according to the Soviet bureaucratic and authoritarian model and remains discredited in economic theory and in practice. This is not to say that communism as a theory is wrong by any means. And the third aspect of this new order, of the post-Cold War order, is the fragmentation of the non-aligned countries movement. This was a strong movement that served as a catalyzer of the powers between the Soviet Union and the US, the East-West conflict. The NAM is in a sorry state now. In the last 17th summit in Venezuela last year, only 10 countries attended it. And this was from a 120 strong movement. 120 members. And most of the leading countries of the non-aligned movement such as China, India, and South Africa, are now even part of the globalized BRICS bloc. And most countries have joined the neo-colonial and neoliberal globalization, allowing the operation of TNCs, transnational corporations. A post-Cold War phenomena that happened right after the decline of the non-aligned movements was also the waning of most African socialisms. We've seen the integration of former African socialist countries into the global neo-colonial order according to the resources they possess. Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Namibia with the oil, Congo with the coltan, Burkina Faso, gold, Zimbabwe, diamonds, and other countries are involved in the cocoa and palm oil international market. South Africa, the white Afrikaner minority, owns most of the economic power base of the country. So we come to the global neoliberal assimilation of people, of the world. Most former revolutionary national liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have become neoliberal populist parties. And I actually cried when Vietnam joined the globalized world, of the maquila world. Social policy, the worldwide privatization of state-owned enterprises, dismantling of welfare state in industrialist countries, social democracy becoming neoliberal, and most national economies are actually tied to the global order of the IMF, the WTO, by free trade agreements.
We would have about 5 minutes if we stick to 15 minutes total. Is that okay for you? 5 minutes more, is that possible? Shall we say 20? So 10 minutes. Okay.
And most importantly, the social movements, a global decline of labor unions, and the indigenous cause has been coming assimilated through neo-colonial economic development and FTAs. So we've gone through, and we are still going through post-Cold War leftist experiments. We're still seeing the socialism of the 21st century in Venezuela that is in crisis. And we already saw the pink tide and the alpha in Latin America. We already saw the experiment of Syriza in Greece. And other, like this World Social Forum, we've seen them pass. And now the Leap Manifesto that's lost steam. We have now the neo-imperial aggression, the open neo-imperial aggression and intervention, the war on terror. And immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, we have the color revolutions, an effort to aggressively assimilate remaining former bloc countries, the Arab Spring, in the subversion of the Arab world as part of the old world. And then come to globalized assimilation with the widespread Islamophobia and white supremacy, wholesale incarceration of blacks, aboriginals, and Hispanics in the US, identity politics, individual rights, middle class entitlement and privilege in the industrialized world. And we come also to a very particular time in the history of the world, which is being called the post-truth times. With the 9/11 attacks, the housing bubble, the 2009 bailouts, the Panama Papers, etc. The corporatization of global politics under bipartisanism, and legislation of population control and surveillance, and the use of high technology in population control. I have the definition of the post-truth times as the objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion that appeals to emotion and personal belief. within that, I bring the quote from Murray Bookchin, the anarcho-Marxist. He talks about the embourgeoisement of people. At present, poor and middle-class people are less likely to view the bourgeoisie with hatred than with servile admiration. They increasingly view the ability to make money and actual wealth not as indicative of a predatory disposition in the absence of moral scruples, but as evidence of innate abilities of intelligence. Newsstands and bookstores are filled with a massive literature celebrating the lifestyles, careers, personal affairs, and riches of the new wealthy, who are held up as models of achievement and success. So we come to the state of the world under global neo-colonialism, where their capitalism stands without any alternative to it. And we have a US-led neoliberal and neo-colonial globalization with 800 military bases worldwide, a NATO, G7, and WTO regime. Politics has been reduced to electoral politics. Fragmentary political resistance to capitalist hegemony, dissent and protest criminalized and violently suppressed. Population controlled by the state-sanctioned globalized corporate mass media and consumerist ideological propaganda. The radical left has been assimilated into a harmless subculture of academic criticism, nostalgia, and affinity leftist groups and cliques. And also the commodification of the world, nature, and knowledge, pursuit of consumerism, social progress measured in material goods and status. But capitalism is in crisis. At the height of the world inequality, we have 8 men who own half of the world wealth, and 70% of world population owns 85% of wealth. The bailouts of banks and other industries sign of bankruptcy of the global capitalist system. And then we have unsustainable growth. 17% of world population consumes 88% of resources and produces 75% of all world waste and pollution. If every person in the world consumed as one US citizen, we would need 4 Earths.
There is now 4 minutes left.
Okay. Coming up, for one thing, is the end of the middle class myth, social engineering, and we can change things through representative democracy. So we are nearing a great global convulsion in capitalist, industrial, military complex after the shift to renewable energy, and a global warming catastrophe and gigantic global migration wave, and the death of casino and cheap nature of capitalism. What are we going to have? Planetary management, stewardship, green capitalism, environmental wisdom. What can be done? In my opinion, we cannot repeat what we've done before. Nothing that we've done up to now, we can repeat. We had to learn from history. Those with privilege will continue to cling on to middle-class myths. What needs to be done is solutions for the marginalized masses. Those propositions are anti-authoritarian, non-doctrinary, non-hierarchical, non-partisan, and are grassroots or community-based. We all need to unlearn assimilation. The real possibility of social and political change is not to be left in the hands of movement leaders or professional revolutionaries. Struggle against assimilation comes out of solidarity and empathy between oppressed and marginalized classes and peoples, based on consensus and equality, without political or decision-making or economic hierarchies, and always accountable to the people within them. For the radical view to remain relevant, it must seek basic points of convergence with those social sectors that harbor even a weakly critical view of capitalism. At the bottom of assimilation, nobody should look for enemies. and there is not one true or correct approach. At the minimum, an anti-neoliberal common front must be aspired to. A systematic critique of capitalism and its self-destructive destination, and a thorough description of our current assimilation into the global capitalist order. So that's what I have for you guys. So thank you very much.
You're speaking without PowerPoint, is that right? That's good. I don't have to do anything technical. So Henry Heller is next. Henry, would you mind if I tried to keep it to 15 minutes?
15?
That's what we recommended. 20. We're on, set the bar now. Sorry.
So I've tried to, knowing this is going to happen, I've tried to cut my talk down to the minimum, and there's going to be a certain incoherence because I don't have the time to develop and nuance what I'm saying, so bear with me. So really the talk has really three parts to it. There is the current kind of definition of what the current crisis is. Then there is a discussion of Marx's idea of the general intellect, and then the place of Leninism, a redefined Leninism, in dealing with the crisis that we're in. So those are the three parts. So let me begin by saying, in the wake of the failure of Soviet communism and demise of the great Marxist-Leninist parties, it seems absurd to talk about either world revolution or Leninism. And so I will talk about both. In the first place, we are living in a time in which capitalism is in crisis once again, as it was in 1914-29 and 1929. But this is not simply an imperialist crisis or a crisis of the economic system. It is a crisis of both. These contradictions are fueling international conflict, and in particular the exacerbation of American militarism, which poses the threat of another world war. The latter makes it possible to envision a nuclear Armageddon, in which case all bets are off. Short of that, the possibility of revolution on a world scale is also on the horizon. We seem to be approaching a tipping point that resembles in its urgency the period 1914 to 1918. So first of all, let me articulate what this crisis consists of. What are the elements of this crisis? We have already mentioned, in the first place, there is a geopolitical crisis based on the system's inability to transcend the pattern of mutually antagonistic territorial states. There is, as a consequence, resultant uneven development and intensified imperialist rivalry. Furthermore, there is a lack of profitability on accumulated capital. There are recurrent speculative bubbles, overhanging debt, and credit crunches, and also a lack of demand. Last but not least is a growing legitimization problem based on the widening gap between the rich and the rest of the population. And finally, lurking in the background is the ecological crisis, which in one way or another will constrain the renewal of the capitalist system. Talking further about the situation of the leading capitalist countries, the United States, despite its recent positive economic performance, in many respects, the United States, a giant state in the heart of capitalism, which some believe is immune to socialist revolution, it is my conviction that, in fact, it is the focal point of the crisis and the weak point of the whole system. Obama represented the ultimate attempt to salvage the idea of liberal reform. The election of Trump signals the demise of the liberal order in the United States, which up to now has been able to contain class and racial conflict. Clinton's defeat represents the collapse of the liberal ideology based on the idea that American capitalism could and would reform itself. In its place has developed a split in the ruling class between the failed liberal democratic elite and those rallying behind the new authoritarianism of Trump. Since the crisis of 2008, the job market in the United States has recovered, but the overwhelming number of new jobs created have been temporary or low-paying. Many young people, unable to find stable employment, have either withdrawn from the system or have gone over to socialism. The liberal intelligentsia, bemused by identity politics or clinging to cultural studies or neo-Keynesian economics, have no capacity to address the crisis. All pretense of reform has been abandoned by the ruling class. Given the reactionary economic and social policies of the Trump presidency, at some point we are likely to see an exacerbation of social and economic problems and an upsurge of protests from below. In reaction, there will be an intensification of state repression. Indeed, the militarization of the police, the growth of the prison system, and deepening government surveillance and censorship has prepared the way for the transition toward a fully authoritarian police state rationalized on the need to preserve the constitutional legacy of the American founding fathers. Any idea that the Americans will willingly retreat from its posture of aggressive militarism abroad is belied by the fact that three generals sit in the cabinet in Washington, testifying to the overriding influence of the military-industrial complex. Their presence will usher in a new and higher arms race involving a whole new level of military spending, despite the fact that the over $600 billion defense budget already dwarfs that of all other states combined. The president has at his immediate disposition a 700,000 strong Praetorian Guard and a large number of volunteer and private armies, as well as an unlimited array of technologically sophisticated weapons. Militarist rhetoric and culture pervades American society, and the growth of large, organized, armed vigilante groups is possible under President Trump. In recent American history, militarism and militarist adventurism has repeatedly been used as a means of evading internal social and political conflicts at home and maintaining American influence overseas, and is once more likely to be seen as a way of out for the political and social elite. Under such circumstances, that is to say, economic crisis, growing class conflict, an entrenched ruling class unwilling and unable to reform itself, an exhausted liberal intelligentsia, an alienated younger generation, embittered racial and ethnic minority populations, and a frustrated and impoverished working class, the United States seems headed towards internal political crisis, one possible outcome of which is revolution. Indeed, a failed military adventure abroad could well be a catalyst for such a crisis, as the population in such circumstances is unlikely to rally round the flag. In more intense form, mass protests could develop as happened during the Vietnam period. Even without a revolution, the result of internal social divisions within the United States could be a management crisis of the American empire. The United States falling into internal convulsions could open the way for revolutionary change elsewhere, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. Now, at this point I want to change the drift and talk about the General Intellect, which was the subject of this is a concept in Marx's work, but which was discussed in a relatively short essay by Antonio Negri in a book published in 2007 called Lenin Reloaded. Lenin begins his essay by acknowledging that Lenin's project looked toward doing away with the state, although in fact it resulted in the very opposite. Despite the unfortunate way things turned out, Negri, who is of course essentially an anarchist, is forced to concede that we must once again return to Lenin's project, which was a political one. But Negri insists Lenin's project must be understood as biopolitical, that is to say, involving every aspect of life. Lenin's noble aim was the victory of the political will of the proletariat, in which body and reason, life and passion, rebellion and design constitute themselves as a biological product, with the vanguard of the proletariat as its soul. And at this point, then, Negri begins to discuss Marx's concept of the general intellect. It is this concept which Negri uses to characterize all the changes that have taken place in the forces of production in recent history, while underlining their revolutionary potential. These changes add up to a major contemporary conflict between the forces of production which are in contradiction with the existing capitalist relations of production. It is this contradiction which constitutes the most important factor behind the movement toward revolution, not only in the United States, but on a world basis. As described by Marx in his famous chapter...
I'm bringing it down in 5 minutes. Is that okay?
In his famous chapter on machines in the Grundrisse, the general intellect is defined as a combination of the accumulated technical and social knowledge that developed under the control of industrial capitalism. But taking his cue from Marx, Negri underlines the explosive contradictions latent within the general intellect. Contained within it are all the vital forces of production and reproduction that are implicit within the biopolitical matrix of current capitalist society. This includes the struggle against wage labor, the demand for leisure and non-work, which are inimical to capitalism and are in struggle against it. In other words, the general intellect includes the sum total of the forces of production engendered by capitalism, but also are in contradiction with the existing relations of production. Basically what Negri says is that, in fact, the explosion of the general intellect, because of these contradictions, is likely to lead to a revolutionary situation in the United States and in the rest of the world. The question is, what is the role then, given the fact that we are in a general crisis, and given the fact that there is this basic conflict between the relations of production and the forces of production in society, as expressed in the general intellect, what is the vehicle to be for the resolution of such a conflict in a positive way, in a revolutionary way? And my point is that Negri himself comes back to Lenin. There is in the United States Paul LeBlanc has recently articulated the outlines of what a redefined Leninist party might look like. And this is what I want to discuss in the few minutes that Alan is going to permit me here. I hope you'll bear with me.
Following the regulations handed down to me by the way.
Yes, I know you yourself are under constraint. Paul LeBlanc has put forward a conception of Leninist political leadership which might be able to overthrow the capitalist state and relations of production while opening the way for the liberation of the general intellect. Perhaps it is not the ultimate form that such an organization will take, but nevertheless it's very suggestive. LeBlanc sees the precondition of a broadly based and democratic revolutionary party to be a large vanguard layer of a broadly defined working class who have more knowledge and organizing experience than the rest. That is to say, there exists in contemporary society a vast number of people who have a real political consciousness and indeed understand the need for the organization of this consciousness into some sort of organized group. This stratum is not organized in a single party, or is not in a party at all, but does have the capacity to educate and organize other workers. It is this group which we can say constitutes at present the organic intellectuals of the working class charged with ensuring the successful realization of the general intellect under socialism. Only through the coordinated efforts of different parts of this broad vanguard layer will it become possible to mobilize tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people in a serious challenge to the capitalist status quo, which should be the primary goal of revolutionaries today. Mass action coordinated by the broad vanguard layer obviously must go with, and is inseparable from, efforts to nurture revolutionary consciousness within more and more layers of the working class as a whole. Various groups and individuals can and should feel free to develop theoretical perspectives, share their ideas, disagree with one another, engage in debates, while continuing to collaborate closely in building the mass struggles. This is the pathway to revolution. If one or another layer, a segment of this broad vanguard layer, and this is very important, under the banner of some spurious Leninism, seeks to dominate the broader effort at the expense of other segments, the result would be fragmentation and defeat. On the other hand, LeBlanc's conception does not preclude the existence of parties which are Leninist in organization. But it is the broad vanguard element which, in the course of the development, forges a revolutionary party. If something approximating a revolutionary vanguard party with good politics and a mass base can actually be forged by different currents joining together in the class struggle, then the question is posed as to how such a formation can hold together and be an effective force in the advance of the working class and the revolutionary cause. Freedom of discussion, including debate over the principles of such a party, should be axiomatic. On the other hand, once decisions about political action are democratically arrived at, they should be binding on members. The importance of free discussion and debate lies in that it is the only way that the realization of the general intellect, which is the basic project, is possible in dismantling capitalism and the capitalist state and moving towards socialism. Such a party would be, on the one hand, would always define itself in terms of the implementation of the project of the general intellect, and on the other hand, have the political means for overthrowing capitalism and creating the institutions of a new democratic and socialist order.
Thank you. David Barkin to the podium.
In the program, the title of our talk is called, let me just first present Alejandra Sanchez behind there with a much more charming smile than mine. Stand up, stand up, Alejandra. Parate. Alejandra is the co-author, but she's really not the co-author. Alejandra stands in for a group of 6 marvelous PhD students who have been working with me for the past 3 or 4 years and who are responsible with me for the development of this talk. The title of the paper, as it's in the program, is The Collective Revolutionary Subject. That's a terrible title. The reason why it's terrible, there are lots of reasons why it's terrible, but perhaps the most important is that it should be called the Communitarian Revolutionary Actor. Because as Elmar Alfater pointed out to us a month ago, all revolutionary actors have to be collective. And that's an extraordinarily important point. And subject comes out of a particular reading of Volume 1 of Capital, which is also contrary to what we're intending in this talk. And that is, actor is an active rather than a passive character. We start from the perspective that at this point in time, trying to think about revolution is an extraordinarily important and challenging effort that we think is no longer possible within capitalism and in terms of capitalism. The notion of creating institutions and social dynamics within the capitalist framework and within the institutional framework and the organizations within capitalism are much too constrained to think about the possibility of constructing revolutionary processes. The reason for that is fundamentally anchored in the notion that the possibility of change of the kind that most of us, I think, are here to talk about in a conference called Revolutions, is an organization that requires thinking about a different way of people organizing among themselves, with each other in groups, and with the planet. And most of the discussion right now is not about that. That involves, and that's because we start with communitarian actors who are revolutionary. They have different cosmologies. For those of you who speak Spanish, it's a better word to use cosmovisions rather than cosmologies, but the translation that we get is cosmologies. The cosmology involves thinking about groups of individuals rather than individuals who have a different relationship with the planet. Because any revolutionary today, any revolutionary movement today must involve a change in our collective relationship with the planet. It also involves a starting point of a changing idea of what is property. Because the notion of property, as is conceived of in most of the literature, is theft. Because private property only exists because it was stolen from nature or people who lived in nature some several tens of thousands of years ago. There is no such thing as legitimate private property. And we would argue that this in itself requires a very profound discussion, because everything we call property today was, in the not too distant past, stolen from someone else. It also involves a discussion of a change in this cosmology, a change in the organization of work itself. The notion that people can work, whoever has a phone on, please turn it off. The notion of work itself is extraordinary, because the notion of work as we think about it today is a notion of doing things for ourselves or for other people. Whereas the notion of work within these cosmologies is a notion of work that is doing something for improving the welfare of our communities and the welfare and the well-being or the ability of the planet to continue putting up with us. So all of this means that we start from a different point of departure. A point of departure which is a different cosmology of the relationship of individuals to each other and to the planet. It also means that it's a redefinition of who we are, of what are our identities. And can we have an identity as an individual? I will not go into all of the implications of that, but perhaps the most fundamental implication is that the notion of a social contract itself is illegitimate, is unacceptable, and perhaps morally abhorrent. It means very, very clearly that we are collective individuals. We are collective, we are members of collectives, and the notion that we have individual rights over those of the groups to which we participate is unacceptable. The community itself is an extraordinarily important concept, is an extraordinarily important element that we must rethink. Not rethink just to give it a different idea, but because the community itself involves a different project for life and for living. It is oriented toward the notion of transformation. I'm not going to go into the extraordinarily arcane discussions that my stupid colleagues that are called economists get into about income and inequality. Inequality exists. It's always existed. The only question is it legitimate? And is it something that socially reprehensible? The transformation, the social transformation that requires, that is necessary in this process, is a collective process of communities operating as collectivities and in alliance with each other to create a new form of exchange and an abhorrence of the notion of specialization. There are 5 fundamental principles for building community. The 5 principles I do not have time to go into, but I will just enumerate them. Autonomy, solidarity, self-sufficiency, but not autarky, self-sufficiency, productive diversification, and the sustainable management of ecosystems. This means that a community is involved in a transformation that requires it to manage its territory responsibly. But no community, and let me emphasize that, no community can manage its territory without an alliance with other communities, because no community is coterminous with an ecosystem which requires the management and the alliances and cooperation of a number of communities to work together. So that there must be, in the case of a watershed, communication and arrangements between people who live in the headwaters and in the valleys of a watershed, so that the water is available appropriately for all parts of the system. One of the extraordinary things about this community and this approach involves the realization that all of the participants, all of the communities involved in this process have the ability and the wherewithal to generate what economists badly call surplus. But surplus not in the profit sense of the word, but surplus perhaps much more harking back to the contribution of Paul Baran. But harking back even further, I would challenge all of you to question the notion that there is such a thing as a subsistence economy. There are, as our experiences in indigenous communities all over the Latin America suggest, there are no subsistence economies. The ones that live in the edge of poverty have been put there, unfortunately, by the capitalist system. But all communities decide how to use their resources, men, women, natural resources, knowledge, youth, and elderly people, in such a way that they may contribute to or take away from collective well-being, as happens in North American societies. this involves then a question of what is the process of transformation. The process of transformation, which is in fact the revolution. I understood you weren't greeting me. The process of transformation is the process of revolution. But most social science analysis today talks about communities in resistance against capitalist incursions of different kinds. Whether it be the threat of North American invasion of Venezuela, as we talked about right before this meeting, or the opposition to mining and hydroelectric or oil pipelines. The notion of resistance is a very important part of community activity today because of the horrible nature of the world we live in. But most of the effective communities that we are talking about and we are collaborating with and who are involved in making a revolution are communities that are building a post-capitalist world. In Mexico, a population of 130 million people, there are 15 million people right now living in post-capitalist societies. I think that this is a very important thing to think about because they are not simply in resistance. They have a project of re-existence. They have a project that they understand of how to build and what are the objectives of a different kind of social organization and a social world. I'm going to run out of time before the last important part of my talk, the only important part of my talk.
You'll have another chance to come back.
Oh, I always have another chance. And one of the nice things about it is that this is all written down and on the internet. In English, French, and Spanish. And soon to be in German. Marx, the underlying body in our conference. Marx talked about social classes, and some orthodox Marxists have stopped reading Marx after he talked about the two classes of the bourgeoisie and the workers. But in 1881, Marx talked about explicitly in a marvelous letter about the peasantry in Russia. And Engels in the 1882 preface to the Communist Manifesto talked about the importance of the commune in the potential for the revolution within the Russian situation. I won't go into that, but the communities that we're talking about are not class communities in that sense of the term. They're multi-class organizations that are learning to collaborate. They are not egalitarian, and they have developed mechanisms for limiting the accumulation of wealth by the richer groups in society. The communities we're talking about are not the wage earners of Volume 1 of Capital. The communities we're talking about are people who are working as a collective, trying to develop a different kind of social organization. They have a consciousness, but not a consciousness of class in the sense that was talked about in the mid-19th century. There's a consciousness of an extraordinary history and heritage, thousands of years to be learned about. And I would invite you all to perhaps take a leave from your Anglo-Saxon literature and read some of the translations in whatever language you can read them in, of the beautiful texts that have been transcribed from peoples who now talk about, as we talk about in a very bad English translation, of living well or well-being. Bienestar, bien vivir o vivir bien. Or as the Zapatistas would call, mandar obedeciendo. Governing by obeying. We talk about, and we need to invent new words, like comunalidad instead of commons. We reject Eleanor Ostrom's concept of the commons. I won't go into why, but Eleanor herself, in her debates with me, agreed that she was talking about the North American commons, and it wasn't relevant for the Third World. I won't go into, and I won't throw out any other names, but there is a need for a consolidation of political parties, not the party. There's a need for communities to take a political action and perspective. And while we're talking about in this conference Venezuela, and why we have to think about the extraordinary imperialism of the Canadians, I would also invite you to think about why the Zapatistas and the indigenous people of Mexico have agreed to participate for the first time in history in the 2018 national elections with an indigenous candidate who is a curandera and is badly translated as witch doctor. I would end then by saying the revolution, as it's commonly understood in Anglo-Saxon society, is a violent process. The revolution, as we understand it in much of the Third World, is a very, very profound transformation which will not happen all at once on a global level, but is already happening with 130 million people living in Latin America in post-capitalist societies. Thank you.
Now, in the program it says I am the chair, which has turned out to be true. It says I am the discussant, and it also says I am Simon Mower, which has turned out not to be true. So I will endeavour to play the role of discussant. And what I propose to do now, we have until 12:45, is to ask a number of questions and invite David and Reinaldo to respond, and then to throw the discussion open for general discussion, and then invite them to respond again, and we'll see how the free flow goes. So I thank the speakers for what I thought were fascinating introductory contributions to this conference. I think it was entirely within the spirit of the organisers of the conference to hear these. I want to pose two very concrete questions in a very sort of blunt way, to put before you the problems that I think we need to confront. And the first is, what do you think of what is now happening in China? And the second is, what do you think of what is now happening in the Middle East? And these are, of course, connected by the growth of what commentators like Pepe Escobar refer to as Eurasia, and what Radica, in her work on geopolitical economy, has described as multipolarity. Because it seems to me a new configuration of nations and the economic relations between them is taking place, and that important as the local developments that you refer to are, that without understanding their relation to the reconfiguration of states that's going on in the world, we have a gap. We have a gap. The second point I want to make relates to Reinaldo's proposal for an anti-neoliberal front. And it explains my first question, because I want to ask a very simple and straightforward question. What do you think would be the outcome of a successful anti-neoliberal front? Now, in China now, and in Russia, neoliberalism, but particularly in China, is on the retreat. But if you don't like what's happening in China, you have to say that there are different possible outcomes of this anti-neoliberal front, one of which you would like because it embodies the ideals of socialism which you eloquently express, one of which you would like because it facilitates this community organization, and another that you do not like. There is a third possible outcome of a battle against anti-neoliberalism, which is fascism. Fascism is not neoliberal. One has to understand it is statist, and that is why Japan and Germany were the first to emerge from the chaos of the Depression, because they used their states, but they used them in a way that I personally would not support. So there is forms of economic nationalism which are very detrimental to human advance. What is the basis on which you would make a choice for one as opposed to the other? And this relates finally to the question of what I would call utopianism. We, I think, in the revolutionary left movement, and you eloquently described this, begin with many abstract ideals of what we would like. How should we judge what is really happening? Do we judge it by what it is doing and whether we believe it is in some sense advancing humanity? Or do we judge it by whether it conforms to what we believe to be the ideal? I think that the second has many dangers in it, because that is the basis on which liberalism of the Trudeau character has basically drawn the left into support for what it calls humanitarian intervention, which is actually war of intervention. That is, the danger is if you promote some abstract liberal ideal and give to your government the excuse to use its armed and economic might against people who are doing something even though you don't necessarily agree with it, you're giving your enemies a weapon which it may not be advisable to give them. So I would caution against the erection of ideals and call for the confrontation of reality as it is. What is happening in China, what is happening in Russia, what is happening in Syria, whether you consider that that is advancing the possibilities for the causes you endorse, or whether you feel it's neutral or whether you feel it's negative. So I would invite that. And then finally, I had a remark for Henry, which is relevant. Oh, sorry, on the question of organising for revolution. This is just, I think I agree with you, but I would qualify the idea that you don't organise for a revolution. I think that you prepare for a revolution if a revolution is objectively posed. It's not the case that a revolution just spontaneously happens. There are certain objective conditions which mature. Lenin described this as the working class can no longer go on living the same way, the ruling class can no longer go on governing the same way. Everybody knows those, and there's a third, and the middle classes are moving to the side of the working class. Those are the objective conditions for revolution. The issue then for revolutionaries is not to make the revolution happen, I agree with you, but it is necessary to prepare for it, in the sense that when it happens, you have to assume the leadership of it, and you have to assume that leadership with definite goals in mind. And if you think the FMLN, even the Granma, the Sandinistas, the Bolsheviks, Ataturk, Sinn Féin, every great revolution, the Iranian Revolution for that matter, every great revolution of the 20th and 21st and 19th century were organised for, in the sense you find in every one, there are organised forces with definite goals. So, a slight correction. Just on Henry, I would just say one thing. The concept of the general intellect seems to me extremely close to Hegel's concept of the general social good. And I believe Marx's criticism of that in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right to be very fundamental, which he said there is no general good. Society is divided into communities which include communities of the bourgeoisie. And the community of the bourgeoisie, because it precisely defends the property that it has stolen. And they are very organized. They have armies, they have states, they have federations, they have chambers of commerce. We even can show you the building they organized against the Winnipeg general strike from. They are a definite community. One does not coexist with them because there is no common interest with them. So that he said society is inherently and by its nature contradictory, and that the process of transformation is a process of eliminating those communities that stand in the way of the realization of the will, not of the whole population, but of the oppressed labouring sections of the population, the majority of the population. So that the dictatorship of the proletariat has a real meaning. It exists in order to suppress those communities who, with every means at their disposal, will try and prevent the achievement of the wonderful things that you're talking about. So it seems to me I would be highly critical of that. I don't think that's what Lenin organised for. Lenin organised for the an international working class culture. That's what he describes it as, in which the divisions between the workers of different nations are not allowed to trump the achievement of a general interest of the working class. And that finally leads me to the state. Revolutions take place within nations. Nations have states. Are we in an epoch when one can propose the notion of a stateless revolution, or a revolution that has no relation to the nation? I do not believe that is possible, but I would like your views on that. So there are only two respondents. I've gone on for a long time because I wasn't prepared for it. It was fascinating. David has his hand up, so I'll let him in first, and then, if that's okay, Reinaldo.
Could we have it at the front?
Pardon? Yes, would you mind coming forward to the front to respond? In fact, perhaps both of you could come to the front, because we are being videoed, and anyway, people can see you. So you guys can sit here, making sure you're in vision.
I'm troubled, profoundly troubled, by Alan's comments, because
they were meant to trouble.
Good. Well, you did it. I'm troubled because he begins with the notion of the nation state. I think that the nation state will not be the unit for social transformation in the world. I think that when I talk about 130 million people living out in post-capitalist society, they do not live in nation states. I'm sorry. They do not live in societies in which the nation states of which they are a part and acknowledge being a part are allowed to govern. And that is a very, very serious question. There is now international jurisprudence which gives these communities, and there are thousands of communities, the legal underpinning to exist within the territory of something called nation states, but they have now been given the right to be autonomous. I'm referring to the 169 Convention of the ILO, which is about the rights of indigenous people for previous, informed, and deliberate consent for any action of the nation state within their territories, which are defined historically and traditionally, not jurisprudentally, not with jurisprudence. And then there is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Human People, of indigenous peoples, because it leaves out most human beings, to govern their territories. And it recognizes their right to be recognized for traditional law. a traditional structure of governance, which may be at odds, as you in Canada know very well, with so-called jurisprudence. So I begin there.
Don't take too long, because we do want to allow
Okay.
the audience the chance
But
to
the
respond
second,
too.
but the second point I want to make is about China. One of the extraordinary things about China is that there is no China. There are many Chinas. And I would recommend to you a rather controversial, I think controversial book, which argues that there are at least 200 million families, and I want to emphasize the word families, that are at the current process of reconstructing rural China. The book is a very interesting book. It was written in a collaboration between the dean of the most important agricultural school, whose name I can't pronounce, in China. His last name is Yi. That's easy. The first part of it I can't figure out how to pronounce it. And what? Okay, Qingguo. Yi Qingguo and Jean Douw van der Ploeg, who I can't pronounce his name. He's from Holland. And it's a Springer book, and it's most of it is now freely available for pirating on the internet. It argues that 200 million families in China are today reorganizing the possibility of food self-sufficiency, environmental reconstruction, and a new population and family policy that involves a circular migration to the World Assembly operation, which is what we think of as China. I quit there.
But stay here, because you're going to get some other questions.
Oh, I'm sure, but I have to continue doing what I'm.
This is what's been happening in my mind. And according to my interpretation of the work, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been the path we will find here. Even though there is a global order, there's a structure. Not every corner of the world has been globalized. I mean, the so-called benefits of globalization have not been brought to every other community, if there is any benefit at all. So, here in Canada, what David has presented as the survival of people living in a post-capitalist world, that view is also sustained here in Canada,
Of course.
in the frame of the struggle of the indigenous peoples. Right now, we're fighting for the UNDRIP to be a law in Canada, and so we have Bill, I think it's 62.
But it is law already because Canada ratified UNDRIP.
It's not law. It has to be turned into law. If we approve this bill, right now has been endorsed by Canada, but the next step is to make it law. I mean, specifically. So we are still doing that, and we participated here in a walk here in Winnipeg just last week. And so I am involved in the indigenous movement somehow, and we are promoting this bill. So the UNDRIP becomes law here in Canada. And The problem with the state in globalization is that is the main tool of globalization. Without the state, globalization wouldn't exist. And so globalization and the state are twins. And if capitalism collapses, it will also mean a collapse of the state in most of regions. And wherever the state is the strongest, the collapse will be greater. But as David already said, there's a whole world that hasn't been globalized in the proper sense. So they are in the outskirts of the global order. And most of countries in the south, or the so-called third world, are already living off the system. Like in Africa, Asia, in Latin America, perhaps I even suspect that it's more than the amount that David has mentioned. Millions. Perhaps even a third of the world, like over 1 billion people, are already living in a post-capitalist world. Disconnected a little bit, but still being dependent on the global order. Now, the last what I want to say about the indigenous peoples had to say something. That's one of the principles that in the indigenous movement here. I'm indigenous from Central America, Mayan origin. So here the indigenous movement is based on this principle that existence is resistance. And that's quite a program in front of the globalizing process going on now. Now, in terms about China and Syria, and I will. There are two elements. China is the result of the globalizing process. China has been globalized, and what we see in China is just the globalization process getting bigger. And with Syria, I would say it is the same crisis that capitalism is going through now. Syria is another expression of the energy crisis of capitalism. Because Syria is a major producer of gas, natural gas, and also petroleum, I believe. And there are geopolitical reasons why the Europe and the United States want Syria on their side, because they have a huge pipeline coming from Iraq through Syria, and that is also a strategic interest of Europe and the U.S. And so of China, I don't think of it as a communist country. It's a fully capitalist country. Is a member of the BRICS, which is the block of countries that have been recently globalized.
Okay, we now have time for questions.
Can I just add just one word here? In Latin America, people are now resisting the word existence and resistance. They're talking about re-existence, a different word than existence. Re-existence is a project, a deliberate, explicit, and increasingly dynamic process for reconstructing a different model of the world for themselves, not for the globe.
Okay, so I saw a question from Ira here, a question here, and did you have your Okay, so two questions first. I'll start there, and then you.
Yeah, I'm sorry to break protocol, but I just wanted to make a very brief statement. And that is that I basically came to this conference to promote the movements and the revolution that's now taking place in Guatemala. And I just wanted to state that the kind of principles that David was talking about, concepts of community and ecological sustainability, etc., is precisely what is going on in that country right now. And they've just won a major victory. They are in the process of transforming the Constitution to meet the requirements that were discussed, that were briefly discussed by David. I hope I'll have an opportunity to talk later on in this conference about it, but there is a present reality that's taking place, which is basically examining or enacting the kind of principles that were talked about in David's discussion. That's all that was.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jeremiah. I had a question for each of you. I also had a question for Henry, but he left. So for Reinaldo, you said in your presentation that you think that it's necessary to repeat nothing from previous experiences, and that's quite a sharp thing. I'm not that I think that we need to repeat everything, but just that I think part of the learning process is learning also what worked, even if it's a few things, but to sharply say, repeat nothing is something that caught my interest. And something I wanted to push David on was this idea of millions of people living in a post-capitalist society. I think that is sort of impossible at this moment to talk about millions of people living outside of capitalism. You could talk about people living on the margins of capitalism. You could talk about people that have not been fully integrated into the capitalist system. But I think, from the difference between, say, what was going on in the First World War to the early 21st century has been a process of a globalization of capitalism in a way that the world, that almost the whole world has been capitalized in this moment. And that market dependency has been growing, it hasn't been shrinking. So this idea that millions of people live in a post-capitalist society is something I would like to try to understand, because I can see talking about people living, as I said, people living on margins of capitalism, but people living outside of capitalism completely, millions of people even, I don't see where you can get that. So.
Yeah, I just have a question for David. So we're talking about this from what
Identify yourself.
I'm sorry. I'm Mujib from University of Sydney, Afghan.
Sydney.
University of Sydney, Australia. By way of yes. So I just had a question about we're talking about these changed notions of revolutions. One that could be predicated on indigenous perspective, as Hindi also, I suppose, pointed out. But we're talking about Middle East, but we're only kind of talking about Syria, whereas in places like Afghanistan and later on in Iraq, we are seeing that capitalism, the capitalist machinations of power, are being imposed in some of the most direct forms, at least in our sort of since the turn of the century. And we are also seeing that Afghans, native populations, and Iraqis also, they're resisting. They're resisting militarily, but also they're resisting in other, what some would call infra-politics as well. So how would you understand the context of Afghanistan and Iraq, or the revolutions, or the not? How can we account for them in this newer equation of revolution?
Just let me get a sense as to other people wish to ask questions. If so, I propose to take responses first and then other round. Okay. If there's only one, maybe we could take your question and then the rest of the time is yours.
Yes, Paul Sanchez, State University of New York at Buffalo.
What time is it? We have another 15 minutes.
I just wanted to ask David to describe who these 130 million people are in Latin America. It kind of connects to your question. Who are these 130 million people? And be sure when you answer me that it's the percentage of the population in Latin America compared to what it was before, because I can also think that these people are not post-capitalist, but maybe even pre-capitalist. In other words, they never got absorbed in the first place. So I don't exactly know what's going on.
And then one quick thing. There is a session which I think, from what you're saying, everybody should be very interested tomorrow, where Colin Gillespie, who wrote a book called People about the Pimichikamak, peoples of northern Manitoba, who have just won historic, or in the process of winning a historic victory, which has much resonance with what you've both been saying, will be discussing with Peter Kulczycki, a long-term activist on native issues in this province and in Canada and worldwide, in fact. And I think you would find it very interesting to have that exchange between North and South America in the context of that. And then I have another question. I think your questions have given me a much better understanding of what you're saying, and I'm grateful to you for that. But I have this following question. It's very good for the 130 million people, and I'm totally in support of expanding that as wide as possible, which is why I'm very enthusiastic and campaign for Aboriginal rights here in Canada, where there's a long legacy of colonialism and people in a certain sense have not gone as far. But what is everybody else supposed to do? That's my question. Become like them, or what's the relation between everybody else and these guys? And there is actually another question.
I'm Lee Arts from Purdue in the U.S. I want to, something that was inspiring to me from both Reinaldo's and yours, and I would have said David, but he's gone, was a discussion which I understood as a vocabulary. In Reinaldo, he's talking about assimilation, and here you're talking about vocabulary, and I find that extremely important. And I would say because oftentimes resistance accepts the vocabulary of assimilation under the expectation that they're resisting, and it's in the vocabulary everywhere. I get goosebumps on my back when somebody talks about grassroots organizing. Grass is what people walk on. There's no power in being the grass. Or when they talk about alternative media, as opposed to saying, we are the majority, that's democratic media. And I even hear it on Facebook when people say, well, I love the flag, I love the anthem, I'm not protesting the anthem. And I would say, why not? Right? I'm not protesting the flag, why not? I love police, why? Right? I like soldiers going someplace, why? No, each of those, once you give space and try to speak the vocabulary of those in power, the old truth to power triteness, you actually are giving up power. Now I realize oftentimes this is rhetorically or persuasively difficult, particularly with an audience that's been raised on that vocabulary, but it thinks that we need to find that vocabulary in the most, non-judgmental way of people that have it, because it's a question of who are we? We are, speaking in the U.S., we are not in Iraq. U.S. military is in Iraq, but we are not in Iraq. We are not trying to blockade Venezuela. The U.S. is, and once we say that we, which is a small thing, or once we use bienvenue, right, there's another vocabulary that we need to find. And I think if we argue about post-capital or pre-capital or non-capital, we also are accepting part of that conversation.
So you can have 5 minutes each. You seem to be deciding that you'll go first. You go.
Well, I have no idea what comes after this, except that I'm on the program 4 times here.
Because you're so popular.
Yeah, because I'm so popular. Because they're giving me room and board, and they're covering. They're charging for it in a very mean way. Left-hand way is the way we speak about it in Spanish. I don't accept that you, as a U.S. citizen, are not in Iraq. You are in Iraq. There is no way that you can disassociate yourself with the, whatever word you want to use, that's going on in your country. I was born in the United States, and I left there 60 years ago because I had a run-in with a guy named Kennedy, and I accused him of going to start the next World War. That was in the 1950s when he was campaigning to be president. There is no way that people can disassociate themselves with the governments that they are a part of. You, in North America, claim to have democracy. That's bullshit. The notion of representative democracy is the best money can buy. I won't go further on that one. But I feel very, very strongly as a person who renounced his citizenship and took a citizenship which, at the point I did it, I was very proud of. And now it's a
Shame.
it's a shame. It's a travesty. Mexico right now is a terrible country, another enemy of humanity. In fact, more people are killed within Mexico than are being killed in the Middle East right now. And I don't think that most of you have any notion of the magnitude of that. All of the people that I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about the 130 I'm talking about, the 130 million I'm talking about are in the Western Hemisphere. And they include I don't know more. They do not live outside of the governments of the societies of which they are a part. But they do live on the margins of capitalism. And they are not pre-capitalist, because all of them, and I can speak with an extraordinary authority that we could go into over a very, very good beer, as long as it's not Colson? What's the shit that...
Molson.
Thank you.
Our beer too.
Molson.
Yes, but there's really good craft beer in Canada.
Thank you. Go on.
The people I'm talking about are people who've lived in capitalism. Most of them have been exploited and have been workers, a member of the working class. They know what class consciousness is. And most of them know a little about the history that came before the conquest. Some of them say they don't know enough. And some of them are having to reinvent languages because there's no one left who spoke their original language. In Mexico, over the past 20 years, 15 new languages have been reinvented. I don't know whether you talk about it. How do you reinvent a language? Well, they're doing it. And in the process, they have rescued more than 700 different new crops, new old crops. Building a post-capitalist society is not something that some academic in my university, that is me, invented the term. We talked about it in extraordinarily lengthy discussions all over Mexico. And even some friends in Zapatista territory say that it's a good term that they will not use. They will not use it because capitalism isn't a concept they want to even deal with. They talk about mandar obedeciendo. When we're talking about rebuilding the world, we're not talking about for all 7, 8, 9 billion people. Most of those people will be murdered, will die of poverty, will die of cancer, will die of whatever. There is no way that most of the people who live in an alienated world are even willing to think about the possibility of a smoother, softer kind of lifestyle that involves a commitment to protect the environments in which they live and on which they depend. So the question for all of us is not, can Vancouver save itself? The answer is no. I have no idea about Winnipeg. I got here last night. No, this morning. But when I went to Saskatchewan and was invited to a temescal, or I don't know what they call it, a steam bath room.
You need to let Reinaldo.
Yeah, no. I was impressed by the fact that they know a different way of living. The question is, how many of you, of each one of us, are willing to think about not having a regular job, but being responsible for the community that you live in and the world on which you live? And how many of you are going to produce the food, not that you need, but that your community needs?
Well, to start with the question that was raised here, the word is not nothing. That what I said, that we cannot repeat the mistakes. Nothing that has not worked, we cannot take and then repeat the same mistake. I am referring here to the political schemes that we following all the philosophies of the proposals. We know that the bureaucratic socialist model of the Soviet Union didn't work, so we cannot go that way. Other avenues that we tried, even anarchism back in the 30s, now anarchism it's a completely living with the system, although it is part of still part of the resistance, but we cannot expect huge change from that movement. And so we find ourselves at a point where we have tried, and I even presented some of the new experiments after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for example, when the Syriza government came, we were all expecting that was the outcome. What was it going to be? But the Syriza failed. The Syriza project failed, and we saw it crash so badly. And that was a remaking of a socialist project. We are seeing now the crisis in Venezuela. Venezuela is a quasi-socialist government, but they are still engaged in the imperialist order. Venezuela provides almost 10% of all the petroleum that is consumed in the US. Venezuela is providing it. So can the US live without Venezuelan petroleum? Yes, they can. But can Venezuela live without selling 10% of the consumed gas in the US? No. The moment Venezuela stops sending petroleum to the US, the economy is going to crash fully, totally, and everything will be gone. The revolution is going to be a figment of someone's imagination. Venezuela is surviving within the globalized order, and it cannot be sustained. It won't survive. I am I don't want to be pessimistic, but I don't want to be a self-deluded person either. I want to see the facts. And so, do we have options? Well, I mean, there are people who are already living outside the capitalist scheme. Capitalism is an order and it also is an ideology. So many people are living outside that ideology of capitalism. And so, that's what I meant when I said nothing of the mistakes. And capitalism comes with the state, comes with the law, the rule of law, and the Western ideology of the rule of law and of knowledge. The interpretation of a consumerist education. Education is also part of the consumerist culture. So I think at this point we cannot go back and yes, we can take whatever we want from Lenin, from Marx, from Mao Zedong, from many of the thinkers. But the thing is, the core of their models have been proven a failure. So right now we have to create a new vision, as David says, cosmovision. And it's totally out of the capitalistic scheme.
Okay, well, I think that's going to be a very thought-provoking note on which to end this discussion. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and particularly to our speakers, including Henry, for their wonderful presentations.